Okay, I think we're good. I see that the number is stable. So, well, welcome everyone to our monthly webinar series on carbon dioxide removal. My name is Daniela. I'm a scientist here at the CMCC and I'm part of the UPTAKE project. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the webinar, just a few slides, and then we're going to start with our panelists. So this webinar, it happens every month. So it happens every second Wednesday of the month, always at 2 p.m. Central European time, always online. And registration is always required. So if you already follow us on LinkedIn, or if you are in our mail list, you always receive reminders of this webinar. Um, and this is part of the Uptake project the goal is to promote knowledge sharing and discussion of the latest development on the carbon dioxide removal science. So Uptake project is a part of the CMCC, and CMCC is a leading research center that's focused on understanding the interaction between climate change and society. We are in Italy, and we are about 450 researchers and staff across three different institutes and three centers. And as you can see here in the map, we have many offices all around Italy. So we have three main departments here. That's the Marine Institute, the Institute for Earth System Prediction, Institute for Climate Resilience, and the Environmental Institute on Environmental Economics. That's where we are here. And we also have three cross-cutting programs in the Institute of the integration of planetary biogeochemical industrial carbon cycle. That's the one we are. And two others that to predict socioeconomic impacts of climate change and global costs as a new frontier. And a little bit about Uptake. Uptake is a project that with the goal is to bridge the current knowledge gaps to enable the uptake of carbon dioxide removal. So we are an EU-funded project with about 20 partners all over Europe. So the project is started in September 2023 and is going to end next year in August. And important as part of this project, we have this Uptake CDR Forum, which is a forum where we bring different stakeholders from different communities to take part of the discussions, to share ideas, to share new developments. And you all can be part of that. So if you follow this QR code, you are going to go to this Uptake forum and you can register and then you can start to interact with all the community. And today, I'm very happy to share the webinar series on the technology, geography, and collaboration networks to assessing global innovation and research funding patterns for carbon removal. And our speakers are Livia Fritz from the University of Geneva and Müller-Hansen from PEAK. And we're going to be moderated by Kavita Surana from Vienna University. Very happy to have you here. And some guidelines, your audio and video, they are deactivated, but you can ask questions in the Q&A that we're going to have time for questions at the end of the webinar. And finally, if you follow this link, it's going to take to a post on the forum that you can ask questions related to the panelists and interact and share ideas on this topic. So if you follow this link, you're going to see the questions. So you're all encouraged to go there and interact with the others. And with that, I will let Finn share his screen and then you can start the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for this nice introduction. I hope you can see my slides and hear me well. My name is Müller-Hansen, and together with Livia Fritz, I'm going to present our joint paper that came out late last year, where we focus on different aspects of CDR funding, so research funding. I will start with a short motivation. So you all know that in addition to reducing emissions, we need CDR to keep the Paris goal in reach And one of the main challenges here is actually if we want to scale up CDR, especially novel methods for CDR, we need to do this on various scales. So at the moment, we see only deployment of CDR in the range of megatons for novel CDR. But in order to provide CDR at the scales that are required, at least in the models, in the integrated assessment models, we need to scale this to gigatons. And in order to provide this scaling, we need a lot of innovation. And one thing with innovation is that it takes time. So when we want to have gigaton scale CDR in 2050, we need to start now investing into innovation in this space. And that's one reason why we are interested in looking at how much research funding is actually already going into this domain. I just brought you an example of a very exceptional upscaling here, which is solar PV capacity. And you can see that it took about 20 years to bridge these these different scales in this sector, where we actually have a high demand. We need to see how this plays out in the CDR domain. But yeah, you can see that even for a technology that has high demand, the scaling takes time, and therefore it's really important to think about these innovation steps for CDR already now. So our framework that we are using in the paper is looking at research funding, but we see this as a first step of a larger chain of innovation. And here's a framework that we're using. So we look in our paper more specifically towards supply push factors, so scientific innovation, but this also needs to be complemented by other activities, especially then commercialization and later diffusion in order to bridge these scales if feasible. So what we set out to do in this paper is actually providing a very comprehensive descriptive analysis of funding patterns for CDR. By the way, this is joint work also with other colleagues from PIC and Aarhus University, namely Sarah Lück, Benjamin Sobercool, and Jan Minks. And we set out in this paper to answer the following research questions. So very basic questions: how much direct third-party funding is actually supporting CDR research? How does this actually develop over time? So how much investments do we see in CDR research funding? How does this change? What trends there are? And then most importantly, how is this actually distributed over different CDR methods, but also over different geographies and disciplines? And lastly, we also go into network analyses where we look at the structures, actually how different organizations on these grants, how do they collaborate, and which networks can be extracted from this data, and what we can learn from that. And our contribution to the literature is actually can be boiled down to these 3 points. So first, we have done quite a lot of analyses looking into what literature is actually out there on CDR. And this is more an output-based indicator of CDR research. And here we look rather at an input-based measure. So how much money is going into this research? And this is somehow complementing the insights that we have gained from the map of the CDR literature, and we can somehow see how this relates to each other. Then we use an approach here that is independent from grant acknowledgements in CDR papers. So previous paper by Presti et al., they used grant acknowledgements in order to estimate some of these properties, but here we really use an approach that's independent from these grant acknowledgements, and thereby somehow have a more independent evaluation of this input-based measure. And last but not least, we also compare our results to the wider distribution of global public research funding in low carbon transitions, which was a topic in other papers. And we find actually some similar patterns here in this more specific field of CDR. After this small motivation, I will now tell you a little bit about the data and methods we used in order to achieve this goal. And then I will hand over to Livia, who will give you an overview of the results. So showing you how actually the funding is distributed across geographies, technologies, and disciplines, and then taking some conclusions and takeaways for research policy and funding. So let me start with the data and methods. So our analysis is based on a research database called Dimensions, where there's a lot of information about research grants that have been reported by different types of actors, both private, but mostly public research funders. And this database comprises more than 7 million grants as of 2024. So it's really big, and we are trying to retrieve from this database those that are related to CDR. How do we do this? We have a very comprehensive search query, which covers 12 different CDR methods, as well as general CDR keywords. So general CDR keywords would be things like removing carbon, carbon removal, also some geoengineering sometimes, because this is sometimes linked. Whereas the 12 CDR methods are really specific methods, such as soil carbon sequestration, biochar applications, or direct air capture. And with this comprehensive search query, we retrieve about 15,000 grants from this database. Now, not all the grants that we retrieve are actually focusing on CDR. Some are just mentioning these keywords somehow randomly or in a combination that we didn't foresee. And therefore, we need to filter these grants further. And for doing this, we actually use a machine learning approach. So we use classifiers that have been trained on scientific abstracts to identify these 12 CDR methods. This was done for this CDR literature map that I already mentioned earlier, published by Lück et al. Also last year. And we actually used those same classifiers to filter our grants further down. Now let me tell you a little bit that this approach also worked. So we didn't just apply that, but we also evaluated the performance of the approach. So what we did, we actually manually coded a subsample of our entire data set, about 550 grants, to assess the performance of these classifiers. And those of you who are familiar with machine learning, we got an evaluation, a metric, which is not very good, but acceptable. So an F1 score of 0.8, which means that the recall, so the number of the number of grants that we get out is 80% of the relevant ones. And the precision, meaning that 82% of those that we retrieve is indeed relevant. And we also applied a further classifier then to see, to show that the methods, or to identify the methods in the different CDR grants. And this doesn't work very well for all the methods, but across the board, it's also acceptable performance. And for some of the methods, it works better, for others, worse. So in total, we identify 6,245 grants as CDR specific. And we then associate this either a general CDR label to that, if it's only talking about CDR in general. For example, in some political science literature, there's no specification whether a certain CDR method is meant or not. Usually they just talk about CDR in general. Then we put a label like that. Or if there are mentions of certain specific CDR options, then we put a label on that. And just to note, we also extract grants on CCS and CCUS just for comparison in order to get an idea how this compares, because this is somehow adjacent to CDR, but not CDR per se. Before I hand over to Livia for the results, I just want to highlight a few limitations that this data set has. First of all, we only look at third-party project-based funding here. So there's a lot of CDR research going on in institutions that have base funding and that do CDR research without acquiring specific grants for carrying out this research. So we don't really capture all the funding because if it's through institutions, this is not in the database. Then the Dimensions database has global coverage, but it's not really clear and really difficult to assess how comprehensive the coverage is. So we can compare this to other databases, and Dimensions seems to be one of the most comprehensive that is out there, but it's really not easy to somehow have a baseline to compare it with. So we can only say that it's one of the most comprehensive, but it's not really clear how comprehensive. Last but not least, there's also the data that we are looking at here is only containing high-level summaries of grants. So these are somehow extended abstracts, if you want, of the grants. Because the full grant applications, they are usually not public. And we then only have this information somehow contained in these high-level summaries to say whether this is really on CDR or not. So it could be that in the more detailed description and somehow in the full grant application, there is mention of CDR or some work package or planned work on CDR, which did not make it to the high-level summary. So this this we don't capture here. And last but not least, there's also some missing data in the database. So we have an issue with funding volumes, but we try to alleviate this by estimating data for these missing funding volumes for about 30% of the grants. And with that, I would like to hand over to Livia.
Thank you very much, Finn. Happy to now walk you through some of my main findings, sort of trying to map the landscape of CDR research funding. If you just go to the next slide, Finn. So the first thing we looked at was sort of temporal, let's say, developments around research funding into CDR. And we do see, so here from around the 1990s onwards, we do see quite some growth in terms of research funding dedicated to CDR. Now, it always helps to put those kind of figures into perspective, which is what we tried in this one here, where we look at CDR funding in relation to funding for climate change research more generally, and also for clean tech research more generally. And we do find growing shares there as well, with around 2 to 3% in relation to climate research, or CDR research funding being 2 to 3% in this bigger picture, and around 4% in relation to clean tech research funding overall. Finn mentioned CCS earlier. We also looked into the comparisons here, and we do find that there is much more funding in terms of volumes going into CCS, even though there are much fewer grants. So these tend to be bigger projects, let's say, in terms of volumes. If you move to the next slide, Finn, you see here the distribution of this research funding for different CDR methods and technologies. This is sort of the overall shares that you see in the pie chart. And what I think comes out very clearly is that the largest shares of funding have been going into conventional forest-based CDR, soil carbon sequestration, biochar, and this, of course, to some extent reflects sort of historical developments, different majority levels of the different CDR options, and that also is explained well, I think, in the next figure. If you move on, Finn, where we look again at the shares of the different methods in a temporal perspective, and we do see that there is sort of, in the past 10 to 15 years, a diversification of methods. On the very top, you see ducks and BACs, sort of the orangey ones from the 2010s onwards, but also biochar, the dark purple red one. So there is sort of a diversification of methods that we see reflected in research funding. And again, these are patterns that align also very well with what other studies have been finding by looking at CDR literature. So not research funding, but literature. Yeah, so these were just to highlight the two methods exactly. The next sort of distribution that we were looking into was the geographical distribution of research funding for CDR. So essentially, we looked at where are recipient organizations based. And again, it's a pretty clear picture. Research funding has been highly concentrated in global north countries, particularly in the US, Europe, also in China. And the numbers you see here are for grants years. If you look at funding volumes, there is an even bigger share of particularly the US, with more than 50% of research funding for CDR. On the other hand, also, I think really very clear, there are very few sort of comparatively very few recipients in global south countries, which mirrors more general sort of patterns of funding distribution that have been found for energy research, for climate research, and also other fields. So this was a geographical distribution. Then we also wanted to understand which kinds of disciplines are receiving funding to work on CDR. How is the distribution looking like here? And we do see that the majority of grants have been flowing into natural sciences, agricultural sciences, also engineering. Now, the numbers you see here, again, are based on grant years. If you look into funding volumes, the picture looks slightly different, and engineering sciences come up in the first place. But in any case, what is apparent is that there's been comparatively very little funding going into social sciences and humanities disciplines, even though we do see in the past 15 years increasing shares of social science grants. And so we did a little qualitative digging into some of the biggest projects that involve social science, and we saw that in many cases the social sciences are sort of part of bigger consortia that are engineering heavy modeling focused studies, where sort of social science come in a very small role, mostly around tasks like facilitation, communication, technology implementation, acceptability questions, and so on. Okay. So in the last part of the paper, we wanted to understand more closely who are the organizations receiving this sort of grants funding, so who drives the research. And for that, we looked into collaboration networks. And this is one of the examples that we looked into here. We are kind of trying to understand collaboration, geographical collaboration between different regions. And I think it might be a little bit small for you to see, but I think there are two things to highlight here from this figure. First of all, that most collaborations happen within the same region. So the purple is sort of the EU 27 region. The blue is the Europe outside of the EU, so mostly Norway, Switzerland, the UK. And we do see sort of fairly little collaboration that goes or that crosses, let's say, regions. That's the first thing. And then the second thing, when looking a bit more closely into different sort of centrality measures, we do find that there is actually quite a few organizations that are very central to the network, in the sense of they're very well connected. And those are mostly institutions that are well established in key fields for different CDR methods. So again, agricultural science, forestry, ecology, climate research more widely. So that's sort of the regional collaboration. And then we also wanted to understand collaborations between different types of organizations. So of course, research organizations are the biggest part of organizations that we're looking into, but there's also other types of organizations in the data set, governmental, private sector companies, non-for-profit, and others. And we tried to understand to what extent is there collaboration across sort of science practice. And for that, we included now not only the CDR data set, but also the CCS data set. And that's what you see visually represented here. The first thing that I think jumps out is that the CCS collaboration network, that's sort of the dark, the pink, sorry, one, and the CDR network, that's the dark black one, are fairly separate spheres. At least there's not too many sort of overlaps. And then in terms of collaborations between research and practice, we do see much more red dots in the CCS network, which kind of visualizes the fact that there is much more research industry collaborations in the CCS network than currently, at least, in the CDR network. Although we can differentiate here a little bit, we do find more company involvement for novel engineered CDR projects, DAX notably, and less so for other methods. We also zoomed a little bit into what types of companies are showing up here, particularly in the CCS network. We find that some of the most connected, most central companies are actually fossil companies, BP, Total, Equinor, Shell, and so on. Okay, that's collaboration networks. So what I've presented so far has been sort of the analysis that we did in the paper. Now Finn and colleagues have also updated the data a little bit in preparation of the new State of CDR report that is currently being produced. And just sort of the overall picture, you can see it here. We still observe so after 2023, which was the cutoff date for our analysis in the paper, after that, we still see an increase in funding volumes for CDR, but we do see fewer projects. So that means bigger funding volumes, but smaller fewer CDR projects. And sort of the trends around around the diversification of methods, particularly an increase in DAX and also some of the other novel methods are also still reflected in the updated data set. Okay, with that, I would wrap it up, just sort of highlighting again what were the main messages and also some of the reflections that we had based around them. The first main sort of message is that we, looking at sort of the past decades, we do see an increase and we do see a diversification of research funding going into CDR technology and methods. Secondly, we did find a very strong geographical concentration with most funding being in the global north. And so one of the reflections around that we had is there is a need for establishing strategic partnerships across regions. We have seen very little sort of collaborations across regions in our data set, and particularly also for building capacities and access to funding in lower and lower middle income countries in the global south. The third main takeaway concerns the kinds of knowledge that we are currently investing in. We did find a strong focus on the natural sciences and engineering disciplines. Now, as CDR is moving more towards real-world applications and deployment, we do think there is a need for a greater inclusion of social science perspectives for various reasons, amongst others, to ensure legitimacy, but also ultimately feasibility of scaling CDR. The fourth main takeaway concerns sort of fact that there is comparatively few collaborations between research and practice. So we do see a need for providing sort of funding incentives for fostering collaboration, at the same time also building capacities for navigating diverging interests and power dynamics in cross-sectoral collaborations. If we think about the central role of fossil fuel companies that we've seen in the CCS collaboration network. And then finally, just sort of a general reflection around the need for interdisciplinary collaborations in order to be able to build systemic perspectives and to sort of situate CDR funding in the wider climate action portfolio. That's the main takeaways that I wanted to end on. And with that, thank you all for listening, and we're looking forward to your questions and comments.
Great, thank you, Livia and Finn, for that excellent deep dive. It's clear CDR funding is not a niche, and it took a lot of work that you did to identify the scale of grant funding, which is a lot more than I had really anticipated. So it was also very interesting to read your paper. So I would like to open the discussion with a few questions, and meanwhile, I would ask the attendees to share their questions in the chat, and we'll come to that in a second. But just to kick things off, it's quite fascinating that you need to do that level of specialized or specific queries and use machine learning to even identify what the CDR related grants are. And given that funding agencies might have their own different approaches on what they prioritize and how they evaluate themselves and their programs, and it may not always be possible for them to do this type of approach internally, what do you kind of see as a pathway for them to think about how to organize or think about their CDR funding, given what you found?
I go?
Yeah, you can go first.
I think one of the things we didn't mention in the talk is that we also tried to identify how much of this funding is actually coming from more strategic initiatives to fund CDR. And we didn't find much evidence that a large portion of this is actually coming from such programs. So it seems like many funders don't actually have this on their radar yet as an important topic to specifically fund. So I think the vast majority of the grants that we have in this database is basically funding through very general programs where a very broad range of topics can be funded. And this is also one of the policy recommendations we could draw from this, that funders need to think about how to, whether they want to maybe set up some more strategic programs, as we have seen in some countries, but there are only exceptions.
If I may, I agree. I mean, I think that's the main point. If I may add to it, since you were also mentioning sort of the diverse terms and whatnot, and I do think it just really also reflects how broad and diverse the CDR field is, and the various different scientific communities, each also with their own traditions that are sort of working on various aspects and facets. And I think one of the points of intervention, if you want, would be around facilitating exchange and learning across different communities. And I think that's also a role that funding bodies can play, for example, through targeted funding programs. Because many of the questions now, as we're moving more to deployment, they actually governance trade-offs, how CDR fits into climate portfolios more widely. They all cut across many different technologies, many different disciplines, and I think that if for funding bodies to encourage those kinds of interdisciplinary learnings and those spaces for facilitated or for structured exchange, I think would be also an additional sort of takeaway for me.
Yeah, I think those are really great points. And to be fair, this, as you also did for clean tech, generally, you also had, it's not so trivial to understand where exactly the funding is. And I also like the slide you showed in the beginning, how long it takes for it was for solar to scale. So getting started now with how funding is organized is also a really good insight from my perspective. And also speaking about interdisciplinarity, another question that I thought and I saw was interesting in your findings was that there's this a little bit of divergence. So in terms of collaboration research networks, European organizations, institutions seem to be the most central, but it seems the US is higher in terms of funding volume to the extent that your data shows. And then you also talked about this interdisciplinarity, which I would see being more probably prevalent in these collaboration networks. So where I also, I'm also more likely to see social science maybe integrated into the larger engineering consortia. Is that something you also observed? And also, given this importance of interdisciplinarity, what approaches do you think would be relevant for funding bodies to consider going forward, and also how would they shape which CDR approaches actually move forward? So just kind of this tension between collaboration and large funding and the geography that is quite different around the two.
Should I start and you jump in, Finn? Yeah, it's true that the data actually reveals quite interesting patterns in terms of collaborative versus single recipient grants, particularly between the US and Europe and EU, even more specifically. Those are, of course, not specific to CDR funding, but also, at least to some extent, certainly reflect nationally, regionally different funding traditions. Finn was also talking about base level funding, which is not at all included in our analysis. We do see some, in terms of methods that are being funded, if I'm not mixing up numbers now, but we do see some regional patterns. For example, in the US, proportionally more research into soils and DACs. In the EU, more around DACs. In China, in particular, around a biochar, which is also something that has been found in literature reviews, I think. To what extent that comes from sort of collaborative versus non-collaborative, I think is difficult to say based on the data, but I do think these different sort of funding models, they certainly shape, the types of questions that we ask, the kinds of perspectives that we bring to whatever method it is that we're looking into. And I think that ultimately shapes, how well we are equipped, I would say, to adopt systemic, integrated, interdisciplinary perspectives on CDR, including, understanding of how risks are maybe interrelated, across environmental, social, technical, whatever spheres. And so, yeah, I think, we do need both, certainly sort of disciplinary deep dives for specific methods, but also, collaborative and interdisciplinary approaches that help us grapple with the complexities of CDR, certainly if we begin to talk about deployment. Finn, what's your take on this?
I think, first of all, there is a quite strong difference that we observe in how the grants are set up. So in the US, most of the grants in the whole data set are actually provided to single institutions. But of those grants that actually have more than one institution, the largest share is within the EU. And I think one of the reasons for this has to do with the EU-wide funding, so ERC and initiatives like this. And I think this is somehow a good model also for showing how to integrate different perspectives in such a project structure. I mean, we also observe, of course, collaboration between institutions in the US, but often these are then not baked into the projects, but rather are somehow evolving alongside project structures.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. I find it fascinating also how social science is integrated into this, and that's kind of leading to my third question, which is also thinking about the global south. So as you quite correctly mentioned, it is important to think about more funding, especially related to the risks and benefits in the global south, and also more social science funding. But there's also this tension that you can imagine a broader need for technology transfer, more engineering and engineering focused projects would be also important. So what kind of collaboration or funding models do you think would really work in extending CDR grant funding and research into the global south based on what you have seen or observed or analyzed so far?
I go first. So I think one of the main problems with this unequal distribution, which, by the way, we also observe for scientific publications, at least if you only look at the English language literature. I think one of the main problems here is that if we look at model results where certain CDR technologies should be applied most effectively in the future, then we see that a lot of that is actually allocated to Global South countries. And there, the risks and the local conditions might be very different from those that we have in Europe or the US, where most of the research is happening. So I think that's somehow our main motivation to say that this needs to change, because otherwise we will oversee a lot of risks and a lot of problems that might arise when deploying these technologies in Global South countries. And here we think as a way forward, because most of the research funding is actually coming from Global North countries, it's really important to build these collaborations. So having funding for both Global North and Global South partnerships to elaborate on these topics and to identify risks in Global South countries that could be associated with these methods.
Yeah, if I think that was an excellent answer, Finn. Just to maybe complement, I think you were asking what kind of collaborations, and just to take a step back, I would say in very broad terms, collaborations that build on equal footing and that are grounded in local contexts, shaped by local needs and priorities. And as a field, I think critically reflecting on whose perspectives, whose knowledge, whose needs shape innovation systems early on, I think is key in general, and even more so in a global or a global North, global South perspective, to avoid, that CDR reproduces some of the patterns of extractivism and exploitation that we've seen in the past. And as Finn was saying, that includes understanding context-specific risks and trade-offs, but I think it also includes, asking questions around ownership of new technologies, patents that come out of research, questions of how co-benefits, financial revenues are distributed, and so on.
Right, there's also several questions related to Global South in the Q&A from the audience. I mean, clearly there's a lot of interest in this topic. I'm going to go through some of them, or at a higher level. But just to kick things off, there was a question which I think follows nicely from this discussion. Now that you have a huge database, and we're talking about these collaborations, etc., is this a way to get started that more organizations and new actors can come together to build these sorts of consortia to work on this type of research? What would be your plans going forward with what you have learned so far?
So I think what we are doing here foremost is, of course, first have a descriptive analysis how these patterns look like, and then we try to derive some recommendations for policy. I think it's really difficult for us to say I think what with the actors that need to somehow take this into account are mainly funders who think about designing programs. And research, of course, can give some hints in which direction this should go, but at least if we think about policy implications, I don't see us in a role where we should somehow go beyond providing those recommendations. Mm-hmm. Maybe more on the scientific side, what we are trying to do also in the context of the State of CDR report that was mentioned was trying to understand a little bit more the implications of this funding and trying to link this to the publication output, but then also steps in the innovation chain that we can somehow measure by certain indicators, for example, patents, and see whether we can identify patterns here that can give us a better understanding how such programs can be designed effectively and what type of funding is actually leading to tangible outcomes and which not.
Clearly, there's a collaboration gap is what I'm seeing from your work, and I think it informs that gap or how to address that gap very nicely. Uh, Shifting gears slightly, there's another question about how you interpret the decrease in number of grants since 2023, while the total value continues to grow. And could it be because some technologies are maturing and the nature of funding is changing from R&D towards more implementation, so larger but fewer investments?
Should I answer this as well, or do you want to go, Livia?
Go ahead.
So I think, yes, this is clearly associated with a trend that we see that the grants themselves are growing, and especially in engineering. So we see this shift towards more novel CDR methods that are more engineering heavy, and those tend to be larger. And a part of the reason why they are larger is that they contain often some demonstration projects where much more resources are needed in order to somehow build such a demonstration machine or demonstration plant. So yes, this is partly driven by this trend, and I think the reason why we see this decrease in funding, I think this is partly due to the overall pattern that we see that climate change research is somehow being questioned. The policy support for climate mitigation is decreasing. So I think here we see somehow just in a small subfield somehow some larger trends that we see for the entire field.
Great, thank you. So I would say one last question, and before we hand off back to Daniela, so please take a couple of minutes to answer. So, what implications do you see that social science is often a small part of bigger technical-oriented grants, and also what could social science grants at an early stage of CDR development look like?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one that has been bothering me as well for a while. I mean, just to contextualize, there is also sort of CDR and social science only, or mostly social science projects. It's just that those tend to be small in funding volumes compared to engineering, particularly engineering heavy projects. And so the ones we kind of qualitatively looked into, we selected those that had big funding volumes. So naturally, that also led us to bigger consortia and so on. So I'm just talking about a smaller part sort of the funding, but I do think there's definitely a discussion to be held around kind of, avoiding that social sciences are mostly predominantly seen in an instrumentalist kind of framing, as in trying to help increase acceptability sort of downstream of the technologies, as opposed to, in early stages, feeding in important whether ethical, social, political questions, and making sure that those are built in when we start to think about the technologies, not only at the end when we are, encountering the one or the other social barrier to implementation. So I do think there's a lot of reflections to be held around kind of diversifying the role and the contributions that social sciences certainly have to CDR developments and implementation in particular.
Thank you. That's a nice final wrap-up question. Finn, would you like to say anything else in the 30 seconds? Otherwise, we pass on to Daniela. Great. Thank you. Thanks, Finn
Thank
and
you
Livia.
for
Yeah,
great
thank you.
moderation.
Thank you all the panelists. And I just want to quick reminder to everyone, if you want to keep this very interesting conversation going, please follow this link that's going to lead us to the forum where you can ask questions, you can exchange ideas. And the last reminder, UPTAKE is also organizing this fourth International Conference on Carbon Dioxide Removal that's going to happen 10 to 12 of June in Milan. And we are going to open the registration for general public on March 30. So stay tuned and register for this conference that we're going to have many more discussions like that during this event. And with that, I give a last thank you to all the panelists and to the moderator for the contribution to this webinar. And thank you to all the participants who asked questions and interact. So with that, I think we can wrap up and have a good rest of the day, everyone.